All right, going to start out this video today with a beginner's introduction to how to play chess. Awesome game, chess. Very easy to learn, the beginning part anyway, and then very complicated, of course, in the end. But nonetheless, it's one of the best games that there ever was. So the game consists of a board, 8 squares by 8 squares, right? And you'll notice that the board has 64 squares on it, right? 8 times 8, 64. The pieces that are used, everybody's familiar with, I'm sure. Most of them anyway. This, of course, is the king. The king is the most valuable player of the game. If you get trapped to where the king cannot move, that's called checkmate. It's called capturing the king. The king never comes off the board because obviously the game would be over. So the whole idea is to move your pieces and get your opponent's piece in checkmate. That's the name of the game. Now, the most important piece next to the king is the queen. The queen is the most versatile piece of the board, and as I will explain later, most important piece besides the king, of course. That's the queen. Now, the bishops, you get 2 bishops. So whether you're white or black, you have 2 bishops. The bishops are an important piece, too. Definitely their characteristics are unusual, and yet they're different than any other piece, except maybe for the queen, and I'll elaborate on that again in a bit. Just outside of the bishops on the board, you have the 2 knights, or you can call them, some people call them horses. The horses are the most unusual piece of them all as far as movement goes. And again, I will explain to that in a minute too. Then on the very end of the board, each end, we have the rooks. The rooks are cool pieces. They move in a fashion which the queen can also move. And yet the queen, of course, has other capabilities. And I'm going to explain that in a moment, all right? So those are your rooks. And then we have the little ones in front of all the pieces, known as the pawn. The pawn, in the beginning of the game, is worth 1 point. And I'll go over the point system in a minute. This is just to give you an idea. If you're going to capture an opponent's piece, you know, obviously you'd be willing to lose a pawn to win a rook or a bishop or a knight or a queen, right? The pawn is worth the least amount. However, there is an exception to the rule. You'll notice your pawn is on the side of the board closest to you, obviously. Your movements is toward the opponent, right? That's where his king is. However, if this pawn gets all the way to across the end of the other board, and it gets on this last rank. These are called ranks right here. This is the first rank, second rank, third rank, fourth rank, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, from the white standpoint, right? So if this pawn makes it to the other end of the board, you can exchange it for any piece you like. So in other words, you could have 2 queens. You could literally have 3 queens if you get 2 of your pawns at the other end. But again, that's for something later on for us to touch on. So let me go back to your pieces, and let's just start with the queen. When you're setting up the board, as I mentioned, the rooks go all the way on the end. Just next to them are the 2 knights. Next to them are the 2 bishops. And then in the middle of the board, you have your king and queen. Now, very important and very easy to remember, the white space on the board always is on the right-hand corner. So you'll never have the board flipped around so that this black space over here is on this side of the board. If you turn it 90 degrees, it would be. And the queen is always on its own color, the same color. So, for example, this is the white queen. It is on a white space. You'll notice for the black pieces across the board, the black queen is on a black space down here. Can you see that? And that's how it will always be set up. However, you'll notice the white space is still in the right-hand corner. That'll always happen. So in the setup, the kings are always opposite each other, and the queen is always opposite each other if you look down the board. Okay? Now, the queen, like I mentioned earlier, is the most versatile piece on the board. However, the queen cannot jump over any pieces. So, for example, you notice there's pawns all in this row right here. Before you can move this queen out, you'd have to move one of your pawns, out of the way so the queen can move. Now, how does the queen move? Well, if you put the queen right here in the middle of the board, the queen can move diagonally like this. Okay? On a diagonal, it can move, or it can move straight. It can move sideways like this, or it can move forward. And it can only do that in one direction at a time during one particular move. So you can't go sideways and then go forward. Or it can go vertical, as I mentioned, but only as far as it can go. It can't jump over any pieces, so when it got to a new piece, it would have to, of course, that would be it for that move, okay? Now, another thing is that there's the queen. The rook can do what the queen can do as far as moving sideways and horizontally and vertically. So if we put it on the board, it can move sideways across the board like this, just like the queen was doing, or it can move straight ahead like this. But it cannot move on a diagonal like I was showing you the queen could do. So that's one of the extras that the queen has in capability. Now, let's look at the bishop for a second. The bishop, of course, is sitting right next to the king and queen. The bishop can move diagonally on the board. Remember how the queen could? Well, the bishop can also move diagonally. Now, that's the cool thing about it, is that the bishop, if you look at the squares where they start out, one of the bishops is on a white space, the other one is on a black space. So since these pieces, bishops, move diagonally, they will never leave the color that they're on. So this black bishop will always stay on the black colored squares. No matter how, long it's on the board, it will always remain on that black square, moving diagonally. The white bishop, in the other sense, will always move on the white colored squares. It makes sense? And of course, just like the other two pieces I mentioned, the queen and the rooks, they cannot, the bishops cannot jump over anything, so they can move in one direction at a time per move along the diagonal, anywhere that they as far as they like. Now, let's move on to the knight. We did not mention the knight yet. The knight cannot move like the queen, and it cannot move like the rook. It cannot move like the bishop, but it kind of moves like the knight, or it kind of moves like the rook, and it kind of moves like the bishop. Let me explain. The letter L, okay, an L, if you were to draw an L, it would go up and over. So if we put the knight right here, the knight can move two spaces in one direction, and then it can move sideways one. It's the picture of an L, And it can move in any direction, of course. All these pieces that I've been mentioning can move in any direction, forward or backwards. And the nice thing about the horse, it can jump over a piece. So, for example, in the beginning of the game, the knight is back here. Your first move, you can actually take this knight and put it over there. You just jumped over these pawns. Now, the reason I mentioned that it can move like a bishop is if you think about it, and the knight is, like, say, right here, it could move diagonally one and then forward one. And that would still be the L shape, okay? But to make it easier for you, moving it straight over one and up two. Or it can move diagonally one and then up one, all right, in that direction. So it's the L shape. And it can jump over pieces. So that's really the awesome character of the knight. Now, you heard me mention earlier about points and point values. As I mentioned, the pawn is worth 1 point in the beginning of the game. However, as it gets closer to the other opponent's side of the board, like I mentioned, you can promote it. It would be worth more. So that's something to keep in mind. However, generally speaking, the pawn is worth 1 point. Now, the queen is worth 9 points. It's like the ultimate amount. It's the most valuable piece on the board, as I mentioned in the beginning. It's worth 9 points. The rook is worth 5 points. The knight and the bishop are each worth 3 points. Okay? Now, they say that the bishop is slightly worth more than the knight. Some will say that the bishop is worth like 3 1/4 points, and the knight's only worth 3. It's a matter of, particular games. Some games, your knight may be more valuable than the knight ever could be. It's all a matter of, particular games or how you feel about it. But generally speaking, they say that the bishop and the knight are just about worth the same amount. Now, if you think about it, then the reason I'm saying this is if you were on the board and you could surrender or lose your queen and you won your opponent's rook and bishop maybe, well, that would be 5 3 points. So technically speaking, the queen might be worth a rook and a bishop and in point value. So you'd consider that as a trade-off if you're going to lose your piece for opponent's pieces, all right? And you might consider that. However, I wouldn't sacrifice or lose my queen over a bishop and a rook. But again, under certain circumstances, it might be feasible to do that. Keep in mind, you're looking for checkmate, right? So checkmate is when you win. Now, check and checkmate are two different things, so let's touch that briefly. Check is when you're being attacked by an opponent's piece. Here's the bishop. Remember, the bishops move in a diagonal, right? And if this bishop was right there on the board, you'll see the bishop is pointing directly at the king, which means it could get the king, all right? So when you put that piece in that position, that would be check. It would now be your turn, and you cannot move. You cannot make another move until you get rid of the check position. That's the rule. So you have 3 choices. Number 1, you can take this pawn or take this bishop, in other words, capture it and take it off the board. That's the first thing you can do. The second thing you can do is block it. If you can put a piece in front of it, then it wouldn't be check anymore. So, for example, this pawn right here, if I moved it forward 1 space, it is now blocking. It's now blocking that bishop. So, in that case, it wouldn't be check anymore. And now it would be the opponent's turn. Now, if he wanted to, he could move forward and take the pawn and put you in check again, you see? But if he did that, this pawn right here would be able to capture it. As a matter of fact, see the knight? Remember the knight moves like an L? 1, 2, and over. The knight could also take that bishop and capture it. So that would be not a good idea for you to take the pawn and lose the bishop, right? Because again, the pawn is worth 1 point, the bishop is worth 3 points, right? So that's another thing that you'd consider. However, let's go back now to the pawns, because we haven't really touched bases on the pawns. Now, in the beginning of the game, when the pawns are all the way on, for the white pieces anyway, they're on the second rank right here, you have a choice. You can move your pawn for the very first move of the game only, but you can move it 1 spot, 1 space, or you can move it 2. Now, if you move it 2, that's an option. Once you've done that first move, you can never move that same piece 2 spaces again. It can only move 1 space at a time. The other thing is that if you choose to move your piece, 1 spot on the first move, the next time you can never move it 2 again. So you've lost that option to make that 2 move in the beginning, once you've moved it 1 time. All right, so that's the only time that you can move the pawns twice, and the pawns only move straight ahead, except, let's say I moved the pawn there and the bishop was there. Now, if it's the bishop's turn, the bishop moves on a diagonal. He could take this pawn, couldn't he, right? So he could take this pawn. But if it's the white's turn, the white captures sideways. Only in the case of the pawns, of course, it's a special rule. Pawns move forward straight ahead, but they capture at a diagonal. So the pawn could take that bishop like that. Now they could also, if this pawn was over here and it was white's turn, he could take this pawn on a diagonal. If he didn't want to take the pawn, though, he could continue to move straight ahead. However, if he did that, it would be black's turn, and black could take this pawn with the pawn. Or, remember the horse? Look at the L shape, right? The horse can jump over and take that pawn if he wanted to, because he can move like the L. So that's another option. Now, the other thing about it is that when you're moving, let's say this black pawn is all the way up here, and it's white's turn. Now, white, if I wanted to move my pawn right here, I could move it 1 spot, or I could move it 2, because I haven't moved yet, right? So it has that option to move 2 spaces. But if you ever in a beginning position like that, and you have your option to move twice, and there is a pawn just 1 space, ahead of you, where if you moved it 1 space, it would be able to capture you, and you move it 2 spaces, there's a special rule in chess called en passant, and that means that you chose not to leave it in that 1 space there so that your opponent could take you. You moved it 2. But the opponent still has the option to capture you, and by moving just as if you only moved 1 space. And that is called en passant. And it only happens in that position where you have the option to move twice, and you take that option instead of moving once. And if you would have moved only once, your opponent could have captured you. Now, he only has that option to capture you that very first next move. So if I'm like in this situation and I move my pawn 2 spaces, it's his move. Now, if he decides to move the knight out, right, do the L shape, and he does that, I can't decide now to capture him And then let's say I move my knight out over here, right? Black can't decide to capture me now en passant. Excuse me. It can only happen immediately after you make that move. And that, my friends, is the basic rules of chess. I don't think I missed anything. Oh, I did miss something. There's another special rule. When you're beginning a game and you're moving your pieces out, a very special rule is called castling. Now, castling is something that we do to protect our king. Remember that the king gets caught in checkmate position where he can't move, then the game's over. So, in that case, let's just say white moves the pawn in front of the king 2 spaces like he can, and let's say black does the same. Remember, white, he can move like an L over here and jump over. And let's say the bishop over here comes out there. All right. Now I'm going to move my bishop over here. And black is going to move his knight out like this. Now you'll notice there are no pieces between the king and the rook. This is one of the conditions where you can do what I'm calling castling, okay? And castling can also only happen when you're not in check or you're not moving through check. You'll notice the black bishop, right? It moves in a diagonal, as I mentioned earlier, and it's pointing and attacking this pawn. Now, if this pawn was not here, that bishop would have a clean angle to come all the way in here. In this particular instance, even if I wanted to, it wouldn't be a good idea, but I cannot castle. If I did, I'd be putting myself in check, right? And the way you castle, just so you know, you move your king 2 spaces, 1, 2, and then you move the rook to the other side of the king. That's how you castle. But because there is no pawn right here, I couldn't do it if there was no pawn there. Because I'd be moving into check or even through check. You can't do it, all right? Now, if you can also castle on the other side of the board. In that case, of course, the queen would have to be moved out, the bishop and the knight would have to be moved out. And once again, you would just move the king 2 spaces over to the left, and then you'd put the rook on the other side of the king. And that's the only move in the game where 2 pieces move at the same time. Now, also, one other thing, I told you how all the pieces move on the board. I didn't even realize, but I did not tell you how the king moves. The king can only move 1 space at a time. So the king can only move 1 space at a time. That means if the king was here, he can only move 1 space at a time. He can move there, but he can move here, but he can move here, right? The reason I'm saying but, he cannot move here. Do you see why he could not move there? Remember, the knight moves like an L. If he moved here, he'd be in check because the horse, the knight, is guarding this spot right here. So you cannot move into check. He could also never move there because there's an L here. So the king is limited to where he can move during a game. He cannot move into check. As long as he moves 1 space at a time, that would be his move. And that's the basic rules of chess. White always starts first. Black never starts the game first. There's, a million ways you can determine who plays the first move or who's going to play white, but the white pieces will always move first in a game of chess. That's it in a nutshell, and hope you enjoyed that. Hope it made sense. I hope I didn't miss anything. If I did, let me know in the comments. Thank you. Have a great day.